Once they roamed the earth, the striped thylacine, the fearless dodo, the mammoth stomping through snow, the dire wolf from Ice Age lore. Now they live only in museums and myths, silent echoes of a lost world. But what if extinction wasn't forever? What if science could, I don't know, reach back in time and reclaim what was lost?
Welcome. Today we're doing a deep dive looking through, well, a whole stack of sources, articles, interviews, scientific notes on this really strange frontier. De-extinction.
De-extinction.
Yeah. Our mission today is basically to unpack this pretty audacious idea, the science of maybe bringing the lost back to life.
It sounds like pure science fiction, Jurassic Park stuff, but this is actually happening. People are funding this.
Oh, yeah. It's real science, real labs, real money.
Okay.
And to really get it, we first need to be clear on what extinction itself actually is.
Okay.
Well, sources all agree. Extinction means a species is gone, forever, permanent loss.
Yep.
It's a natural process over long time scales. Sure, species appear, species disappear.
But what's happening now isn't exactly natural, is it?
Not at all. It's the speed. It's fundamentally different.
And terrifyingly fast. I saw one source estimating, 30,000 to maybe 55,000 species lost every year?
Exactly. And another projecting we could lose maybe half of all species by 2050. The rate is just staggering, maybe 10,000 times faster than the background natural rate.
Wow.
Yeah. Many scientists are calling it the sixth mass extinction. And it's pretty clear it's driven almost entirely by us, by human activity.
What are the main drivers?
The sources point to a few big ones. Habitat destruction is the giant, like 85% of species on the red list are threatened by it.
Right.
Then you've got climate change, pollution, overfishing, hunting, invasive species. It's a lot.
Okay, so against that really grim backdrop, we have this idea, de-extinction, or resurrection biology.
Right, some prefer that term. And it's important that the sources really stress this. De-extinction is maybe a bit optimistic or misleading because you're not getting the exact original animal back. Not identical genetically, not with the same learned behaviors, the instincts, the microbiome, everything that made it fit its specific time and place.
So it's more like creating a stand-in, a property.
Exactly, or a facsimile, a new version that has some key traits of the extinct one. And there are a few ways scientists are trying this.
Okay.
There's selective breeding, sometimes called backbreeding.
Right.
You basically take related living animals that have some ancient traits and breed them to try and, well, recreate something similar to the ancestor.
Like that project trying to bring back something like the aurochs, the wild ancestor of cows, using old cattle breeds.
Precisely that. But the really headline-grabbing stuff involves the high-tech genetics, cloning, like Dolly the sheep, making a near-exact genetic copy.
Which is hard enough on its own.
Incredibly hard.
Yeah.
And then there's genome editing, especially CRISPR.
Ah, CRISPR. That's the DNA cut-and-paste tool we hear so much about.
That's the common analogy, yeah. It lets scientists go into the DNA of a living species and make really specific changes, tweaking genes, or even inserting genes from the extinct species.
To give it the traits of the lost animal.
That's the idea.
So which animals are they actually targeting? It's not dinosaurs pulled from amber, right?
No, not quite yet anyway. The main targets mentioned again and again are things like the woolly mammoth.
The big, hairy Ice Age elephant.
Yeah. The dodo, that flightless bird from Mauritius. The thylacine, or Tasmanian tiger.
The dog-like marsupial, right. Extinct much more recently.
Exactly, 1930s, which is important. Also the dire wolf, the massive prehistoric wolf, and the aurochs we mentioned.
What makes these species candidates?
Usually it's about having decent enough DNA samples, which is easier for recently extinct species, like the thylacine, much harder for ancient ones. And crucially, you need a closely related living species.
To provide the base genome, or even carry the baby.
Both, potentially. So, Asian elephants for mammoths, domestic chickens maybe for dodos, and these little mouse-sized marsupials called fat-tailed dunarks for the thylacine.
Wait, a mouse-sized surrogate for a Tasmanian tiger?
Yeah, the scale difference is significant. It highlights the challenges. And the fact that the thylacine DNA is better quality because it's more recent definitely helps its case.
Okay, so who is actually doing this? Is it university labs or?
There are university researchers involved, but one company really dominates the headlines here.
Colossal Biosciences.
That's the one. They're mentioned everywhere in the sources. Yeah. Based in Texas, big funding, very high profile. They're explicitly aiming to revive the mammoth, the dodo, and the thylacine.
But they call it what? Not just de-extinction?
They frame it as disruptive conservation and preservation, kind of a Silicon Valley take on saving species, you could say.
And their main method is CRISPR, the gene editing.
Primarily, yes. The plan for the mammoth, for example, is to take the genome of its closest living relative, the Asian elephant, and then use CRISPR to edit in specific mammoth genes. Genes associated with things like shaggy fur, thick fat layers, maybe those curved tusks, a domed skull, even adaptations in the blood for dealing with extreme cold.
So let me get this straight. It's not cloning a mammoth from ancient ice. It's engineering an elephant embryo to be mammoth-like.
You got it. It's creating a hybrid, a proxy. And then, the really tricky part, implanting that hybrid embryo into a surrogate mother, presumably an Asian elephant, maybe even an African elephant, though that's less closely related.
That sounds unbelievably complex and ethically fraught.
Hugely complex, yes. The biological hurdles are immense. And Colossal is ambitious with timelines. They've publicly aimed for the first mammoth-like calves by 2028.
2028, that's really soon, considering elephant pregnancies are almost 2 years long.
It's incredibly ambitious. The Dodo project, using chickens, might be faster just due to shorter generation times, but still faces huge technical barriers. And the thylacine, using those tiny Dunarts, well, that's another massive challenge.
Okay, so we kind of get the how, at least in principle. But the big question hanging over all of this, the one that comes up in every source, is why? Why even try this?
Well, the proponents, especially Colossal, lay out a few key arguments. They talk about rebuilding species that might be better suited for today's changing environment, or enhancing biodiversity by bringing back unique forms of life.
Filling gaps in the ecosystem.
Right, replenishing ecological roles that were lost when the original species disappeared. Making ecosystems more resilient, they argue.
And the mammoth is the prime example for that, isn't it? The whole mammoth step idea.
Exactly. It's their ecological poster child. The theory, basically, is that if you reintroduced large herds of these mammoth proxies to parts of the Arctic.
Like Siberia or Alaska.
Yeah. The idea is they're grazing, they're trampling down snow, breaking up shrubs and mosses, even their dung fertilizing the ground. It could help shift the landscape back towards a grassy steppe, away from the current mossy tundra or encroaching forests.
And why is that good?
Well, proponents argued those grasslands are actually better at storing carbon in the soil. And there's this other idea, maybe more speculative, that by trampling snow, they allow the winter cold to penetrate deeper, potentially slowing down the thawing of permafrost.
Which releases huge amounts of greenhouse gases, so they could be climate engineers.
That's the pitch. A pretty grand vision. For the thylacine, the argument is simpler. Restoring an apex predator to Tasmania could help rebalance the ecosystem there, controlling populations of other animals.
Okay, ecological engineering. What else?
A big part of their argument is also about the technology itself. They say the process of developing all this advanced genetic engineering, the reproductive tech, it creates a powerful toolkit.
A toolkit? For what?
For helping living endangered species. That the tech developed for de-extinction will have spin-off benefits for conservation right now.
Okay, so that's the case for it. Ecological restoration, tech development, but I imagine there's a lot of pushback. The sources must raise concerns.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of concerns. The ecological risks alone are massive.
Like,
well, first, will these proxies even fit? Modern ecosystems are totally different from the ones these animals lived in. You introduce something new, even if it's based on something old, and who knows what happens.
Could they become invasive?
That's a major worry. Could they outcompete native species?
Yeah.
Disrupt food webs? One source specifically mentioned the thylacine proxy potentially causing problems for dingoes in Australia, if they ever got there.
Yeah.
There's just so much uncertainty, we don't really know the consequences.
We've seen problems even with reintroducing existing species, right? Like wolves.
Exactly. Wolves in Yellowstone were a success story in many ways, but they didn't just stay put. Animals move, things happen. There are even questions about whether mammoths might negatively impact climate, maybe eroding permafrost in some areas, or releasing methane.
Yeah.
We just don't have the answers.
And then there's the welfare of the animals themselves, the ethics.
This is a huge point in the criticisms. Cloning, surrogacy. These processes have incredibly high failure rates. People always bring up Dolly the sheep.
The first cloned mammal.
Right. A landmark achievement, no doubt. But it took 277 attempts, failed embryos, miscarriages, stillbirths, to get that one live lamb. 277.
Wow. That number really drives it home.
It does. Now imagine trying that with elephants. With their complex biology and long pregnancies, how many failed attempts, how much suffering for the surrogate mothers would be involved?
And using endangered elephants as surrogates in the first place.
Exactly. Is it ethically defensible to put endangered Asian or African elephants through those risks, potentially dozens of failed pregnancies, for a proxy species? especially when those surrogates could be carrying calves of their own endangered kind, some critics call it, well, using endangered animals to create visually entertaining novelties.
Ouch. What about the money? This must cost a fortune.
Colossals raised over $225 million, according to one source, and critics jump on that, saying imagine what that money could do for existing endangered species. Habitat protection, anti-poaching patrols, proven conservation methods that work right now.
So a resource drain, a distraction.
That's the argument. Some call it a pet project of billionaires, focusing on headline-grabbing tech instead of the hard, unglamorous work of on-the-ground conservation.
Is there a deeper worry, like a moral hazard?
Yes, that comes up a lot. The concern is, if people start thinking extinction isn't really permanent, that we can just bring species back later. Does that make us less careful now?
Less urgent about protecting habitats, fighting climate change, stopping poaching.
Precisely. If you think there's an undo button, maybe you're less worried about pressing delete in the first place. It could create a false sense of security.
And it ignores the fact that the world they lived in is just gone. You can't bring that back.
Exactly right. One source put it perfectly. A species isn't just its genes, its environment, all the other species around it, its learned behaviors, its culture even. You bring back the genes, maybe, but you don't bring back that whole context. How does a lab-created mammoth proxy learn to be a mammoth? Where does it learn migration routes, what to eat, and how to interact?
It's facing a world it's completely unprepared for.
Totally unprepared, which makes successful reintroduction incredibly difficult, maybe impossible for some species.
Okay, let's talk about the T-Rex in the room, Jurassic Park.
Huh. Yes, it always comes back to Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
It's the cultural shorthand for this whole idea. And, for all its movie magic, it did have that core warning.
Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
That's the one. And the reality of de-extinction, based on everything we're seeing, is way messier, slower, and less predictable than a Hollywood movie.
No neat hatching montage.
Definitely not. We talked about the failure rates, Dolly's 277 tries. It's not just plugging DNA into an egg. It's incredibly difficult biology.
And even if you succeed in creating a few animals, you need huge numbers for any real ecological effect, right? That mammoth steppe idea needs herds, not just one or two.
Exactly. One source cited a study estimating Alaska's North Slope alone might need something like 48,000 mammoths to have a significant grassland impact. And for a climate effect across the Arctic, maybe hundreds of thousands.
How could you possibly produce that many? Using elephant surrogates seems unthinkable at that scale.
It does. The only alternative discussed is artificial wombs, which, well, they're not really here yet. And one source described that prospect as 1984. Scary stuff. Whole new ethical nightmares there.
And even if you could breed them in numbers, would they be healthy?
That's another issue. Starting from limited ancient DNA means low genetic diversity. That makes populations really vulnerable to diseases, genetic defects.
Yeah.
They might just not be very robust.
And then you release them. Conflicts with people seem inevitable.
Yeah. The sources point to existing problems. Elephants raiding crops in Kenya, aggressive bears causing issues after reintroduction in Italy. You'd need massive education programs, literally teaching people how to live alongside mammoths or thylacines.
And the biggest point, maybe bringing them back doesn't fix why they died out.
That's the fundamental problem, isn't it? If the habitat is gone, if climate change makes their old home unsuitable, if people are still a threat, you could bring them back just to watch them go extinct all over again.
Okay, but Colossal argues this isn't just about bringing back mammoths. They talk about that toolkit for conservation. How real is that?
This is where it gets really interesting and maybe less controversial. The argument is that the cutting-edge genetic techniques they're pioneering do have immediate applications for living species.
How so? How does trying to edit mammoth genes help, say, a rhino?
Well, the techniques for working with degraded or ancient DNA, the precision gene editing, these could be used to boost genetic diversity in critically endangered populations. Many are suffering from inbreeding because their numbers are so low.
So you could maybe use DNA from museum specimens or older generations to reintroduce lost genetic diversity?
Yes.
Or even engineer in helpful traits?
That's the potential. Sources mention efforts like the Northern White Rhino Project, where Colossal is apparently involved in trying to engineer diversity back into embryos using stored genetic material.
Or work with red wolves.
And fighting diseases.
Yes, they're exploring engineering resistance to specific diseases, like a herpes virus that affects elephants, making endangered species more resilient. Though some experts are skeptical if that tackles the main threats, right? Like poaching or habitat loss.
True. There's skepticism about whether it's addressing the biggest dangers, which are often human-caused, but the potential is there. They're also building DNA databases, genetic backups for endangered species, core preservation tech.
And it spins off beyond conservation, too.
Apparently so. The sheer amount of computational power needed for all this genome work has led Colossal to spin off software companies. And those tools, developed for analyzing animal DNA, could potentially be applied to human healthcare cancer research, designing new drugs. They're even thinking about spin-offs focused purely on ecosystem restoration.
So it's a whole ecosystem of innovation, really, driven by this one big, maybe crazy idea.
It seems that way. And the sources do touch on, well, more speculative futures. Pet cloning is already happening if you have the money.
Right. Paying a fortune to get a genetic copy of your cat or dog.
And inevitably, it raises those sci-fi questions. Could this tech eventually lead to attempts to revive humans? Does it connect to anti-aging research, ideas of cheating death, at least for the super rich? Films like Pet Sematary or Prometheus play on these deep-seated, maybe uncomfortable ideas.
It forces you to think about what life even means, doesn't it? And who gets access to controlling it.
Absolutely. And it all happens against the backdrop of what documentaries like Racing Extinction show so clearly.
Mm.
We're in a mass extinction event right now, driven by us. Illegal wildlife trade, habitat loss, climate change, melting ice caps, acidifying oceans.
It makes protecting what we still have seem incredibly urgent.
Hugely urgent. And it reminds you how connected everything is, from the tiny plankton making oxygen to the biggest animals shaping landscapes. Interestingly, the de-extinction proponents would argue their work is part of that fight, part of understanding and maybe healing the planet.
So wrapping this up, it's a real tension, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have this incredible scientific possibility, using amazing technology to maybe undo past mistakes, restore ecosystems, generate knowledge that helps living species, maybe even human health. It's ambitious, exciting.
A story of human ingenuity, maybe even hope, trying to gain some control over life and death itself.
But then, the other side. Massive ecological unknowns, serious ethical questions about animal suffering and using endangered surrogates, the huge cost diverting resources from immediate needs, and that moral hazard making extinction seem less final.
It really makes you ask, is this about genuinely fixing the past and helping the future? Or is it maybe a really impressive, really expensive distraction from the hard work of saving the life that's right here, right now, struggling? What does this whole quest tell us about our relationship with nature, our belief in technology, maybe even how we think about death?
It's definitely about power, about responsibility, and maybe about learning when it's time to let go.
Thank you for being on this deep dive with us. Stay curious, stay grounded, and stay tuned for the next one.